Alright, let's put down our baby's toys. We're gonna play on a real macho console, yeah! Oh, there's a little smudge on my DS screen. What?
Drawn to Life: The Next Chapter on DS was announced the same day as the Wii version back in May 2009. According to interviews with Jeremiah Slaxa, this game, along with Super Scribblenauts, were meant to be the last hurrah on the Nintendo DS console. Fifth Cell gave up on the Nintendo DS before Nintendo even did. In the YouTube interview I keep talking about from 2020, Jeremiah states that this game takes place in only a matter of days since the first game. I feel bad for the Raposa. They can't go a week before some sort of world-ending chaos beholds them, especially if the Wii version is considered a prequel to this game. At least when Peach gets kidnapped, it's usually only on major special events. The story starts off with a much darker tone than any other game in the franchise. Considering how the first game ended, I feel like this couldn't have been avoided. There's secrets out. This is not a cute little kids game. Ignore that concept art. Instantly, we are tasked with recreating a vague nightmare scene with our chosen descriptions and drawings. Too bad I can't draw because this whole thing that was meant to be taken seriously looks like I was trying to be funny and I wasn't. The game starts with an animated credit sequence to set up the game, showing Heather, Mike's older sister, looking over a hill. And while this is compressed, this is still beautiful on the DS. She then gets consumed by darkness by picking up a ruby staff. She should have gotten the Sapphire or Emerald version. The village appears to be completely different this time around. Maybe it's geographically the same, but it's isometric now, so it's more of a recreation if anything. It doesn't matter, we don't spend that much time here anyway. After failing to make a new hero, the village starts losing its color due to Wilfrey, please gasp. Some villagers live and make it onto the turtle from Majora's Mask, and some get sent to various villages. Joey's back, by the way.
This escape from the village didn't even last like a week.
Eventually, you make the hero, but one thing that sort of frustrates me is that there's no way to bring over your hero from the previous game. I don't know if this would have even been possible. It's not like the base DS had any internal storage, but having the option via a trade like Pokemon would have been so cool. I mean, you can trade heroes between each individual game, but there's no connecting between the first and second. Even having a transfer between the Wii and DS versions would have been really cool. Nintendo did the same thing with Mii's occasionally, and it could have at least sort of tied the two games together in some way. Petty complaints aside, well, it's a Drawn to Life sequel, alright. One of debatably 3. The main village is no more. Instead, we use the turtle ship to visit 4 individual islands, which themselves are connected via pages like a book, which is a super cute touch. I have to say though, this village is really hard to navigate. They look detailed, too detailed. Your guess is as good as mine as to what's a wall and what's a pathway. Instead of having 15 long levels and a few bosses, this game goes for the approach of having many shorter levels, and each world has anywhere between 9 to 10 now. The collectible system is now simplified, which I feel is sort of disappointing, but it's been a downwards trend, so the first game is now the exception rather than the rule at this point. I don't know, with so many new towns and unique characters, I would have really liked to see the same treatment from the first title, as that really helped me invest in those characters. On the flip side though, it's not a bad thing to change up the formula once in a while, or else you get trashed like modern Paper Mario. There's still some fantastic stories told via these new villagers. We meet King Miney and the citizens of Lava Steam. King Miney went crazy with power due to Wilfrey, as those below him have to cope with being used. There's Galactic Jungle, which is a more basic story of literally just trying to restore color to the village, but in the process, we learn about the government that runs the area along the way, which is surprisingly in-depth, but by far one of the most emotionally impactful moments of the game takes place in the first world. This is Watersung Village. I thought these people were pilgrims. It's more so some sort of Shakespearean era parody, with lots of fancy people, yes. This guy is named Sock. This city is being tortured by a character named Salem. He is after what's called a promised conch, which due to a deal gone wrong, he got his hands on. As a result, the mayor, named Rose, will lose her voice, and as a result, the village will die. The story gets surprisingly dark, especially for the first row of the game. Like, give us a bit of time before you traumatize us, okay? Essentially, even though we get the conch back, Rose decides to not attend the festival and therefore plans to end her life, even knowing the effect it will have on her kid, Miles. My God.
My son, can you see that our troubles have run high? This is where we draw the line. This is where we say goodbye. You know what I want, believe it or not, I've already got, and I know I've got to go away.
She ends up living, but that doesn't matter. I still need therapy.
Could this story get any more grim?
Now, the next two villages are really not as depressing, to be fair. The final world, we'll get there. We'll get there. It is an interesting tone, though, that the game sets right out of the get-go, and the story is followed by Marie's internal conflict that carried over from the first game, her feelings that she was never cut out to be the mayor. Mary even goes so far as to support Rose's decision to end her life. Think about that. That's incredibly morbid. After all of this goes down, Mary flees, which I at first interpreted as her being scared upon seeing Rose's survival, which was induced by the creator, and realizing, well, there's no way out. I can't do this anymore. And we spend the next two chapters with her basically being MIA from the game. My interpretation isn't entirely correct, but the game's narrative is rich enough where I think it's possible to develop those complex thoughts before you reach the final chapter. It's a really interesting plot to analyze. Marie is such a good character because of her relatability. Sometimes we can't be our best selves. Sometimes we fail. She's not some perfect, flawless character as we usually see in protagonists, in a stark contrast to the mayor from the first game. Her dad, who was a defined leader, good at what he did, and he wanted to do it. Marie was never meant to hold the role of mayor in her eyes and has been having doubts since day one. Seeing it be fated ultimately reinforced her fears, and that's incredibly valid.
I think there's also a video game somewhere inside here.
The story isn't done, but I want to talk about the last world separately, as that's its own beast, and my credit card still hasn't cleared from my last therapy sessions. So yes, there's a video game here as well. The newest additions include two new forms, a blob which lets you go up the crevices and small paths, and a spider which lets you climb up walls like Spider-Man. Yeah, obviously. The blob sucks, it's very slow, and it feels unnecessary, but the spider is one of my favorite inclusions of the franchise. It has a sharp learning curve, but it's fun. Swinging from wall to wall, shooting webs at enemies, it's rewarding. It feels like a more refined version of the ninja power-ups from the SpongeBob game. The only thing I hate is switching between the forms itself, because it takes like 2 seconds.
I'm sure this was an animation they were really proud of and not the DS being bad at loading. This is your fault.
The live drawing from the Wii version is not present, but there are separate drawing areas now that serve as puzzles where you're given a limited amount of ink to draw the proper platforms to get to the end. These are fine and a good idea at a very minimum, but they're incredibly easy and not hard to figure out, meaning it ultimately feels quite underutilized and not very fleshed out. The difficulty of the collectibles range from literally appearing at the front of the level with zero challenge or skill involved to practically impossible to find. What a hearty and healthy balance. Call this game a cereal. There was one level where I needed the spider power-up, but this was before the game even tells you it exists. So I explored this whole level for an hour before looking it up and realizing I had to come back later. The collectibles are practically useless anyway. If you get all the pirate coins, you can buy exclusive songs from Isaac's shop. Wow.
I'm so glad they added a way to listen to music. I mean, there's just nowhere else in this world that I could do it.
I feel like these coins are a scam. The tutorial says, find them all to uncover a hidden treasure. How are songs that are sung and written by people in another dimension hidden treasure? There's also citizen coins obtained upon finding a villager. Same kind of deal as the pirate coins. Honestly, unless you want the extra challenge or the additional collectibles, I would not bother. Yeah, there's really not a lot of reason to explore these levels despite them being designed pretty well and being pretty fun, and that's especially when some of the coins are right at the start. New to this game though are jars of color. These exist in game to give back color to the overworld, meaning they're theoretically a really good collectible, but their usage throughout the game definitely whittles as it goes on. The color jars were actually very hard to come by at first. I had to go back into levels and grind for more color in World 1, but after that I always had way too much. Like, look how much I had left over at the end of my playthrough. This means unless you're really not focusing on picking up the jars, you'll always have an overabundance, meaning this gimmick is kind of meaningless even though it's a good idea.
So the lack of collectibles and reasons to explore definitely makes me prefer the first game over this one. That's not to say Drawn to Life the next chapter on DS is bad, but it kind of lacked that original charm and love that I had for the DS version, at least in the gameplay. But I'd say the story is a lot better. I like the shorter levels, but the thing is with the collectibles in the first game, it made me really feel like the game wasn't just trying to be a platformer and was trying to be its own kind of beast, which I think Drawn to Life 2 kind of lacks that sort of identity.
Here the developers are honing in a bit more on creating a par-for-the-course platformer. I wouldn't be surprised if this was also a request from THQ, who were already trying to make this series resemble Mario. Thankfully, this isn't always just 2D platforming. The vehicle sections from the first game return, and there's even some entirely unique levels here, like killing aliens by dropping bombs from a spaceship.
But you can't talk about Drawn to Life, the next chapter DS, without talking about the pivotal ending. Well, yes I can, it's my video.
The next game in the series was
Sub-Series Cinemation. Sub-Series Cinemation.
Fine.
We end up at Wilfrey's wasteland. Here we find Wilfrey and, well, Marie. Even the mayor from the first game makes a cameo here, giving this an otherworldly feel. Going with that theme, the bulk of the levels in this world aren't brand new, but more or less are recycled from the previous 3 villages. This was clearly done to cut costs, although there are still 2 new levels here. It's not a huge deal, but it is disappointing. If they wanted to go with old assets and cut costs, the least they could have done was reuse levels from the first game. At least then you could call it a throwback. I mean, Nintendo's been doing that for years now. They don't get called out for it that often. The final fight against Wilfrey is honestly really disappointing as well. There was almost no challenge, and it happened so quickly, I honestly didn't even realize it was the final boss. The bosses in this game were actually really good until this fight, though. Watersong has a fight against the pirate ghost Baki, which honestly might be the best in the game. Lava Steam City has a 6-phase boss fight, which goes on way too long. I don't know, I'm not big on it. It has okay gameplay, but it takes an eternity and a third to get through. And Galactic Jungles is also pretty bad, as you just mash dropping bombs on the same enemy. So the last 2 bosses specifically are way too easy, especially when you compare them to how genius the final fight against Wilfrey was in the first game. At a minimum, it's anticlimactic. Narrative-wise, it does start out with an automatic death, followed by a cutscene of everyone praying for your survival, which is an amazing way to build the stakes and the tension. So story-wise, the beats are there. I just think it needed to be an actual epic fight to match the heat of the moment a bit more. The gameplay is by far the weakest part of this final act, though, and not the thing anyone talks about when they think about this game. So let's talk about this story, because on that end, there's a lot more to say. Right before the final level, Wilfrey tells you the stakes outright. Upon returning color, everyone will cease to exist. The reason Marie decided to make a deal with Wilfrey was to try to keep everyone alive by preventing this outcome and stopping the return of color. On the surface, this is quite commendable, as this is the ultimate sacrifice Marie can make to save her villagers, the people she vowed to protect, and cast doubts whether her running away in the first place was even out of fear or purely to figure out how to save her village. She's attempting to defy fate after seeing how the creator kept color alive with Mayor Rose. But the question arises, why does the creator want color to return to the Raposa under these circumstances if it means the end of the world? Well, I am going to answer this, but first, we need to address the very controversial ending of this game. Now, this is going to get heavy, and I do have to give at least a little bit of a content warning. So if you want me to skip over this game's ending, I'm going to throw a time code on screen. It's nothing too bad, but I thought it was fair regardless to offer. Drawn to Life, the next chapter ends with the villagers gathering around the eternal flame, preparing for the end. At one point, Marie goes up to Mike, the human villager from the first Drawn to Life, saying that Wilfrey showed her him. We then see the villagers dissipate, and Heather, his sister, repeats the exact phrases that we gave at the start of our journey. What comes next is another credit sequence with an original, beautiful song, where we see real-life interpretations of Mike and Heather in a car crash.
I couldn't live without, and I'm pouring my heart, and I'm spilling my soul, and I'm taking a breath, and he's giving his all, and I wanna walk out from the trouble I'm in, 'cause I'm really not sure where to begin. And if making it will make it better, better than it was before, and lies could bring us close together, so I won't be lonely no more. Pretending it doesn't matter could help me pass the time. Make believe he'll hide forever. This is real life.
I'm not crying, you're a baby.
This is one of the saddest things I've ever seen in a video game, let alone a game for kids. Mike and Heather do end up surviving, with the status of their parents ambiguous. Essentially, the events of Drawn to Life are a result of a coma that Mike was induced to as a result of this car accident. The reason the creator, and then eventually Marie and Joey, want to restore color to their world is because upon doing so, Mike will escape the coma and survive, thus ending the world that the villagers lived in, but sacrificing that for the greater good, a real human life.
So I played this game as a kid like I did the first game. This is one of the few things I vividly remember, and that seems to be a big theme. When I read online, people have that same sort of experience. But the thing is, for me, this is one of the first times I remember having genuine emotions while playing a video game and being that invested and caring so heavily about that story. And I think that ultimately led to me loving video games the way I do now and potentially making videos about them.
Video games tell stories. This one was bold, it was ambitious, and unfortunately, it was a bit too intense for a lot of children who weren't expecting it. Fair enough. I could argue that this game was sort of testing the waters with water song art, but it doesn't feel appropriate when so many kids were genuinely upset by seeing this moment. However, at least with my experience with the game, Drawn to Life: The Next Chapter is what led to me having an appreciation for narrative-driven games such as Xenoblade, Red Dead Redemption 2, and even narrative-driven series like BoJack Horseman. Even though all of this took place inside Mike's brain in a tragic moment, it only makes me appreciate Marie and her decisions throughout the game a lot more, because ultimately we're all trying to survive, we're all trying to do the right things in life, and sometimes we don't have the right answer. Marie panicked at first, making a deal with Wilfrey to keep everyone alive, but in the end she decided saving an actual life was more important than saving villagers who didn't even exist. She cared about saving a human, a villager who barely had a role in the first game, even if it means her and her friends and her lover would no longer exist. And it exemplifies that Wilfrey, as sort of a devil allegory, was trying to take Mike's life by removing the color, thus killing Mike, whereas the creator was trying to save his life by filling it with color again.
There's a lot that could be said, and I know this is kind of darker for a channel that's about having wacky fun with video games, but the fact that the ramifications of this story can be discussed to the extent that they are, and that the fact that we can analyze it so in depth from so many different angles, that is a sign of amazing fiction. And the fact that we're still talking about it to this day in any form means it did its job of being art.
It's hard for me to even think of Drawn to Life and The Next Chapter as individual games, as it's so hard to imagine one without the other. These stories and these characters continue seamlessly into each other, and I can't imagine not playing both of them. My heart almost wants to just lump them into one grand game, but if I were to argue rationally, I vastly preferred the original game's gameplay and vision. But it's close, and it's very close, and Drawn to Life: The Next Chapter has a much superior story to balance out its weaker gameplay. I don't think it's worth saying even if one's better than the other though. Both games, while not being the best games ever made, are something special, and you should play it if you can. It's also important to note that a Drawn to Life collection was released in 2010 for the DS, containing both mainline games. In this version, they changed the car crash into falling out of a tree, which, like, that's still sad, but a car crash is just so much more tragic. Whereas falling out of a tree, it kind of just lost the emotional impact of it, I don't know. This was done in response to the ESRB getting complaints about the tragic ending of The Next Chapter, and future prints of the game would also have the tree ending.
Are you a car crash household or a tree household?
Regardless, the car crash ending is the official canon ending, and it is to be treated as such going forward. So it's important to note that the tree ending was purely done to appease the ESRB and angry parents across the globe.